This story centers on the disappearance of Taylor Pomaski, a 29-year-old woman who vanished in the spring of 2021, leaving behind a trail of silence that would eventually unravel into one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Harris County, Texas. What initially appeared to be an ordinary missing person report quietly evolved into something far more troubling, involving a volatile relationship, unanswered warning signs, and a conclusion no one expected to face. There were no emergency calls that night, no frantic screams heard through open windows, no alarms, no shattered glass, no obvious disturbance, just a brief fire flickering in a backyard before dawn, burning low and then fading out. It didn't draw attention. At the time, it didn't seem to matter. Taylor was last seen at her home on Stallion Brook Lane in Spring, Texas, during what was described as a small, informal gathering. Friends came and went, music played, drinks were poured. On the surface, the evening appeared unremarkable. But by the next morning, Taylor was gone. Her car remained parked outside. Inside the house, her personal belongings were untouched. Her phone, purse, and even her dog were still there. No one reported her missing. No one contacted police. Days passed in silence. Taylor had been dating Kevin Ware Jr., a former professional football player, for several months. Neighbors later described the couple as private, rarely social, and often tense. Friends sensed something was wrong, though few could clearly articulate why. Arguments were not uncommon, but the true severity of the situation remained largely hidden. The night of Sunday, April the 25th, 2021, marked the last confirmed sighting of Taylor. Guests arrived expecting a relaxed evening. Some recalled laughter. Others remembered raised voices. At least one guest later described a heated argument between Taylor and Kevin that stood out from the rest of the night. Taylor appeared shaken. One person said she wanted to leave but never did. Another claimed she had been shut inside a room for a time. By midnight, the gathering had thinned out. One by one, people left. Taylor did not leave with them. After that night, no one could say for certain what happened inside the house. What they did know was what didn't happen. Taylor didn't answer messages. She didn't return calls. She didn't contact her mother, something she never failed to do. Her digital presence went completely dark. Nearly a week later, her parents, who lived out of state, contacted police after repeated attempts to reach their daughter went unanswered. Officers conducted a welfare check at the Stallion Brook Lane residence. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. No visible damage, no sign of a struggle, no indication she had packed up and left. At first, investigators considered the possibility that Taylor had chosen to disappear on her own. Adults are allowed to do that. But something didn't sit right. People don't usually vanish without money, a phone, or a word to anyone they trust. As detectives began piecing together the early timeline, one detail surfaced repeatedly. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Taylor had been changing. She withdrew socially. She canceled plans. Her messages grew shorter, guarded. She hinted at stress but downplayed it whenever someone pressed for details. Just weeks earlier, police had responded to a domestic disturbance at the same address. No arrests were made. No charges filed. Taylor declined to give a formal statement. At the time, it was logged as routine. Only later would investigators realize it was anything but. In the days following the welfare check, investigators began quietly reviewing Taylor's recent activity, or more accurately, the lack of it. There were no bank transactions after April 25th, no debit card use, no rideshare requests, no social media logins. Her phone had not connected to any nearby cell towers. In a world where even short walks leave digital traces, Taylor had left nothing behind. The timeline was narrow but unclear. The last confirmed sighting placed her inside the Stallion Brook Lane home sometime between 10:30 p.m. and midnight on the night of the gathering. No one remembered seeing her walk out. No neighbor recalled a car pulling away late that night. There were no outgoing calls or texts from her phone after that window. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood. Most residents reported loud music and shouting earlier in the evening, but nothing that stood out as criminal. Then one neighbor mentioned something unusual. She recalled seeing smoke in the backyard late that night or very early the next morning. It wasn't large, just a small fire burning briefly before daylight. She assumed it was trash or a fire pit and thought nothing more of it. That detail was logged but not acted on immediately. When officers returned to the house for a second walkthrough, they paid closer attention. Still, there was no obvious crime scene. No bloodstains. No broken furniture. No signs of forced entry. But subtle things began to feel off. The bathroom appeared unusually clean. The grout lines in the shower had a sharp chemical smell, as if they had been aggressively scrubbed. There was no record of professional cleaning, and no explanation offered for why it had been done. The absence of evidence didn't reassure investigators. It unsettled them. As they dug deeper into Taylor's personal life, a pattern slowly emerged. Friends described similar conversations, even though they didn't know each other. Taylor would raise a concern, then immediately minimize it. She would say things like, "It's just intense right now," or "We're figuring things out." On more than one occasion, she admitted she was scared, then laughed it off. About a month before she vanished, Taylor had made a late-night phone call to a friend. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. She spoke quietly, almost whispering. At one point, she said something that stuck with the listener long after the line went dead. "If something happens to me, please remember this." She never explained what she meant. 2 weeks later, on April 7th, deputies were dispatched to the Stallion Brook Lane address after a report of a domestic dispute. Body camera footage later showed Taylor standing stiffly, avoiding eye contact. When asked if she felt safe, she hesitated, then nodded without saying much. She declined to press charges. The officers left. The report was archived. At the time, it seemed minor. After her disappearance, it looked very different. Investigators reviewing Taylor's phone records noticed deleted conversations and incomplete drafts. One email draft stood out. The subject line read, "In case you need to know." Inside was a single sentence. "I didn't fall off the radar." Below it, another line remained unfinished. "They pushed me." The message had never been sent. By the time detectives began connecting these details, Taylor had been missing for nearly 2 weeks. Her name was finally entered into the National Missing Person database, but the delay had consequences. Surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses had already been overwritten. Trash collection had come and gone. Potential evidence was lost to time. Internally, some detectives began voicing concern. Taylor had no history of disappearing, no financial preparation, no pattern of cutting off contact. And yet, officially, she was still considered a voluntary missing adult. That classification limited resources. There was no large-scale search, no alert, no immediate forensic sweep. Only a growing sense that something critical had already been missed. The case shifted quietly in early June, not because of a confession or sudden discovery, but because of what the evidence continued to refuse to show. Adults who leave voluntarily almost always resurface in some measurable way. They buy something. They contact someone. They trigger a signal. Taylor did none of that. Investigators revisited the April 7th body camera footage from the domestic call, this time frame by frame. Taylor's posture stood out. Her shoulders were tense, her movements minimal. When the deputy asked if she felt safe, the pause before her response lingered longer than anyone had noticed the first time. She nodded, but her eyes never lifted. The man involved in the dispute remained mostly off-camera. With that context, detectives requested warrants to access Taylor's phone data, cloud storage, and search history. What they found added weight to the unease. Her final recorded search had been typed but never submitted the day before the party. What to pack if you have to leave quickly. It was a fragment, not a completed query, but it suggested preparation, not escape. Analysts noted something else. Even when adults disappear intentionally, they rarely shut down everything at once. Phones still ping towers. Accounts still refresh in the background. Taylor's digital life stopped completely. It was as if a switch had been flipped. By mid-June, the case was formally reclassified as involving suspicious circumstances. That change allowed homicide liaisons and forensic specialists to step in, even though there was still no body and no confirmed crime scene. The investigation returned to the Stallion Brook Lane house with a different objective. This time, they weren't looking for obvious signs of violence. They were looking for what had been deliberately removed. The master bathroom became the first focus. Chemical testing revealed residues consistent with strong oxidizing agents, the kind used to break down biological material. That alone meant little. But microscopic analysis of samples taken from deep grout lines told a different story. Trace amounts of human blood proteins were present. The DNA profile matched Taylor. There were no visible stains, no pooling, no spatter. Just fragments embedded in porous surfaces that cleaning couldn't fully erase. The finding didn't prove how Taylor died, but it proved she had bled there. Attention then turned to the backyard. Investigators collected soil samples from a scorched area near the fence line where a neighbor had reported seeing fire. Lab analysis detected byproducts associated with burning organic matter and synthetic fibers, materials commonly found in clothing. Elevated calcium phosphate levels were also present, a compound often released when bone or tissue is exposed to high heat. It wasn't enough to say a body had been burned, but it was enough to rule out ordinary trash. Inside the house, carpet samples from the hallway leading to the back door revealed faint hemoglobin signatures beneath the surface padding. Again, not visible. Again, not accidental. The pattern suggested movement between the bathroom and the backyard, followed by extensive cleaning. When questioned, the homeowner's account did not change. Taylor had left after an argument. There had been no unusual cleaning, no fire worth mentioning. By now, the absence of evidence had taken on a new meaning. Investigators began using a single word repeatedly in internal notes: containment. Whatever had happened, it had been controlled, confined, and intentionally concealed. Then, months later, the case took a turn no one could ignore. On December 10, 2021, a worker clearing brush near a remote drainage ditch in North Harris County noticed something strange tangled in the soil. Burned fabric, melted hardware, charred fragments that didn't belong to any animal he recognized. He stopped work and made a call. By the end of the day, crime scene tape surrounded the ditch, and Taylor Pomaski's case changed forever. By late afternoon, forensic teams had secured the drainage ditch and begun a careful recovery. The location was remote, heavily overgrown, and almost invisible from the nearest road. It sat miles outside the neighborhood where Taylor was last seen, offering natural concealment and no nearby surveillance. The terrain itself told a story before any lab results did. Scattered along the ditch were fragments of burned material, melted zippers, warped plastic components, deformed metal eyelets consistent with athletic clothing. Among them were brittle, blackened bone shards, fractured and partially calcined. There were no intact skeletal structures. Whatever had been left there had been exposed to intense heat, but unevenly, as if the fire had burned quickly and without control. A forensic anthropologist oversaw the collection. The remains were consistent with human origin. They were transferred to the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences for further examination. Within days, specialists began working with what little was left. Dental fragments were compared against existing records. The process took time. Heat damage complicates identification, and there was not much to work with. Nearly 8 months had passed since Taylor disappeared. The confirmation came quietly. The remains belonged to Taylor Pomaski. With that, the investigation shifted fully and irrevocably. What had been treated cautiously as a suspicious disappearance was now officially a homicide. Detectives reopened every report, every lab result, and every interview with new urgency. The question was no longer whether Taylor was alive. It was how she died and who was responsible. Due to the condition of the remains, pathologists could not determine a precise cause of death. There were no bullet fragments, no ligature marks, no definitive signs of blunt force trauma. A fracture to the skull was noted, but it was impossible to say whether it occurred before or after death. The final report was careful, almost restrained. Homicidal violence cannot be excluded. Investigators turned to geography and timing. The disposal site was mapped against known movements, cell tower data, and travel routes. One detail stood out immediately. Roughly 12 hours after Taylor was last seen alive, a mobile device associated with her boyfriend registered in the same remote area where her remains were found. The signal wasn't exact, but tower triangulation placed the device within a narrow radius that included the ditch. It was the only time that phone had ever been recorded in that location. Back at the Stallion Brook Lane house, investigators layered old and new evidence together. The bathroom traces, the hallway carpet, the backyard burn residue. Individually, none of it proved murder. Together, it outlined a sequence: an incident inside the home, cleanup using harsh chemicals, an attempted burn, a hurried disposal far from the neighborhood. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Some declined to speak again. Others repeated what they had already said. But one new detail emerged. A guest recalled seeing the homeowner early the next morning, shortly after sunrise, using a power washer on the back patio. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. Now, it did. Detectives also began hearing from unexpected sources. While in custody on unrelated charges, inmates reported overhearing vague statements about taking care of a problem and cleaning things up properly. The language was indirect, nothing specific, but multiple accounts echoed the same tone. By early 2022, prosecutors began assembling a case. There was no weapon, no confession, no eyewitness. But there was a body, forensic residue linking two locations, digital movement data, and behavior that defied innocent explanation. The pieces were finally aligning. With Taylor's remains identified, investigators shifted their focus to building a precise, provable timeline. Digital evidence became central. Subpoenas were issued for historical location data tied to all mobile devices associated with Kevin Ware Jr. When the records came back, they revealed hundreds of data points spanning the days surrounding Taylor's disappearance. The pattern was striking. From the afternoon of April 25th through the early morning hours of April 26th, the phone remained stationary at the Stallion Brook Lane address. There were no interruptions, no brief departures, no unexplained gaps. Then, at approximately 6:13 a.m., the device began moving. It traveled west, then north, following a route consistent with rural service roads leading out of the city. 22 minutes later, the phone stopped. That stop occurred less than a mile from the drainage ditch where Taylor's remains would later be recovered. The device remained in that area for just over 20 minutes before returning along the same route. It was the only time the phone ever visited that location, before or after. On its own, the data proved nothing. But when aligned with the forensic findings, it became a critical anchor point. Investigators re-examined the house one final time, this time with the timeline in mind. Plumbing inspections revealed irregular residue buildup in the bathroom drains. Sludge samples from the sink and shower traps contained degraded organic material, too damaged for DNA typing, but consistent with biological waste. Forensic consultants concluded that the material had likely been introduced after April 25th. Carpet analysis along the hallway reinforced the same route. Trace hemoglobin signatures embedded deep in the padding suggested movement from the bathroom toward the back door. No visible stains had ever been present. Whatever occurred had been followed by immediate and thorough cleaning. In the backyard, burn residue samples were compared against those recovered from the ditch site. While direct chemical matching wasn't possible due to time and environmental exposure, both locations showed similar combustion byproducts. Analysts concluded the backyard fire was likely an initial attempt to destroy evidence, abandoned quickly, possibly due to odor, smoke, or visibility. Investigators also reviewed what didn't happen. No emergency call was made. No missing person report was filed by anyone in the house. Messages from Taylor's family went unanswered. Her disappearance was treated as an inconvenience rather than an emergency. Behavioral analysts weighed in. They noted that post-event actions mattered as much as physical evidence. Cleaning aggressively, altering surfaces, burning material, leaving town briefly, remaining silent. Each action, taken alone, could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern consistent with concealment. As the case advanced, prosecutors began outlining potential charges. They knew the risks. Without a confirmed cause of death, a jury trial would be uncertain. But the convergence of independent evidence streams made the narrative difficult to dismiss. Then a new piece surfaced. Forensic technicians recovered fragments of deleted data from a secondary mobile device linked to the suspect. The phone had been factory reset, but cached memory yielded partial text strings. Among them was a single line, incomplete and untimestamped. "It's done, just like we planned." There was no recipient listed, no context, no confirmation of intent. But the timing placed its deletion within the same window as Taylor's disappearance. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to move the case forward. By mid-2022, the district attorney's office convened a grand jury. The grand jury proceedings began quietly in late July. Prosecutors presented the case methodically, piece by piece, aware that there would be no dramatic moment, no single piece of evidence that stood on its own. Instead, the case relied on accumulation. Digital movement data, forensic residue, behavioral patterns. Each element reinforced the next. Jurors were shown the phone records placing the suspect's device at the Stallion Brook Lane house throughout the night, followed by the brief trip to the rural area where Taylor's remains were later found. Analysts explained tower triangulation and why the margin of error still placed the phone within the immediate vicinity of the disposal site. Forensic experts testified about trace blood proteins recovered from the bathroom grout and hallway carpet, emphasizing how such material can persist even after aggressive cleaning. They discussed the backyard fire, the chemical byproducts, the presence of compounds associated with burning organic tissue and synthetic fabrics. Not proof of incineration, but strong indicators that something biological had been burned. Witness testimony followed. Guests from the gathering described the argument, Taylor's visible distress, her desire to leave. Neighbors recalled the fire. One described seeing power washing activity the following morning. Investigators outlined the delay in reporting Taylor missing and how critical evidence had been lost as a result. Finally, jurors were told about the recovery of Taylor's remains, the condition of the bones, the inability to determine a cause of death, and the fact that despite that uncertainty, the remains were undeniably hers. On July 28th, the grand jury returned an indictment. Kevin Ware Jr. was charged with 1 count of murder and 1 count of tampering with a human corpse. He was immediately transferred into state custody. The court ordered that he be held without bond pending trial. His legal team released a brief statement denying the allegations, arguing that the case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence and speculation. They emphasized the absence of a murder weapon, eyewitnesses, or a definitive cause of death. Behind the scenes, prosecutors prepared for a difficult path forward. They knew the strengths of their case. They also knew its vulnerabilities. Without a clear cause of death, the defense could argue reasonable doubt. Any trial would be long, technical, and emotionally draining for Taylor's family, with no guarantee of a conviction. As months passed, negotiations began. By early 2023, both sides were weighing the same reality. A plea agreement could guarantee accountability. A trial could risk everything. The decision came quietly. Kevin Ware Jr. agreed to plead guilty. The plea agreement was finalized in April 2023, nearly 2 years after Taylor Pamaski vanished from her home. There would be no jury trial, no opening statements, no cross-examinations. Instead, the case would end in paperwork and a single admission of guilt. In Harris County Court, Kevin Ware Jr. pleaded guilty to murder and tampering with a human corpse. The judge accepted the plea and imposed a sentence of 30 years in state prison. As part of the agreement, all rights to appeal were waived. The conviction was immediate and final. There were no dramatic scenes in the courtroom. Taylor's family was present but silent. They declined to give victim impact statements. The proceeding was brief, procedural, almost clinical. When it ended, the court moved on to the next case,